Today I want to talk a little bit about some of the incidental issues about writing a macro. I want to remind you that macros are powerful, dangerous things really, and they can do unexpected stuff. This is a reminder to you to save your work before you run a macro to test it. I've done this several times myself. What you might find is that you run the macro and it stamps data all over your nice spreadsheet, and you can't use undo when data's been changed by a macro. So you might think after doing that the best thing to do is to close the spreadsheet and lose all of your changes to your macro. Well, the other thing that can happen is you can get into a crash situation. So you've made your machine crash. That can happen as well. It's happened to me several times. Also, actually, you can also get into a loop, an everlasting loop. Actually, that's okay. If you do get into an everlasting loop, don't worry. Just hit the escape button. It'll stop the macro from running. That's a good tip, I think. Anyway, what you need to do is make sure you save your spreadsheet before you run your macro to test it. Now, saving a macro. Excel knows very well that macros are very powerful, so its default file type for spreadsheets is this XLSX type, which won't run macros, and what it does, that file type means that it won't actually save all the scripts that you've done, so you must obviously save it as an XLSM type. What this also means, and I'm sure you'll have seen this, when you open spreadsheets and if they've got macros on them, Excel will give you the option to open it in a way that won't run the macros. Of course, what you need to do is make sure that you and any users of your spreadsheets, when they open one of your spreadsheets, that they do allow the macros to run. And I'll show you how to do that in a moment. So the reason why we try and improve macros by getting involved in the script rather than just recording them is that we can make them better, we can make them more efficient, so that they don't include all of the lines which is purely incidental. And if you remember the macro that we were working on in the last videos, there were some lines which just moved the spreadsheet around. We were scrolling up and down and we didn't need those, so we excluded those, so that made that more efficient. You can also make macros run more quickly, and I'm going to show you some good tips about how to run macros more quickly in later videos. You can make them more effective, of course, because they do exactly what we want, not what we thought we were doing when we recorded them. And very importantly, we can make them robust, which means that they work in more circumstances than the ones that were existing when we recorded the macro. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, and I'm going to come back to that later on in this video. So why do you record macros? Well, there's a couple of good reasons. Very often it's a good starting point to write a macro. Just record one and then improve it. It's also an extremely good way of learning new commands, and I guess that I've probably learnt most of my skills in writing macros, such as they are, by reviewing macros that I've recorded. So do carry on using the record macro function, it's really useful. Now I want to talk a little bit about the robustness of scripts. It's a good thing to stay humble with writing scripts, and I always kind of think there's always bugs left in my scripts. Some of them come out quickly and some of them take longer to become apparent, and some may never become apparent. Doesn't mean they're not there. So for instance, things may happen and which cause the macro to crash or not to work in the way you expected it when there's a different cell selected, if you're on a different workbook or a different tab. You may have changed the contents of the spreadsheet, or you may have taken an earlier macro script and embellished it, and now you're going to introduce more bugs into it. So do try and bear that all in mind, and you'll write better scripts. think about who you're writing the macro for. Usually either you're writing it just for yourself, or you're going to put it in a spreadsheet which is available to other people, and if you've become an expert in writing macros, then it's quite likely that the macro will be used by other people. In those circumstances where you've got a long task to do yourself and you've written a macro just in order to do the task that day, and you're absolutely sure that's as long as the macro is going to be used for, then of course you can write a kind of sloppy macro without all of this robustness in it. But it's so often the case that a macro lives so much longer than you expect it to do. I think it's quite a good thing to try and write them well. So think about who's going to be using the macro and write a quality macro whenever it's appropriate. So these are some other ways you can make a macro more robust. One of my favourites is to create a button to run the macro from. If you do this, you know that when the macro is run, it's probably going to be run from the tab and the spreadsheet that you want it and expect it to be run from, which may be the spreadsheet that the macro is actually written into. And you saw me do that on the previous videos. I really also recommend that you put remarks in your macros. You may think that the only person who's going to look at this script is going to be yourself, but it's surprising how often a macro takes on a life of its own. If you can write in there exactly what it's trying to do, then it's going to be very helpful for someone else who tries to debug your macro when it goes wrong later for some reason or another. Also, I would encourage you to keep your script very tidy and use that indenting that I showed you. Another good trick is to break the code up by calling other subroutines, and I'll show you more about that in later videos too. Use this workbook object a lot. That means that you know that you're referring to the workbook which the macro has been written in. It's another way of avoiding the user doing something unexpected by running the macro when they're actually in a different workbook entirely. Another good technique is to use the set command, so that you assign an object, perhaps it's the sheet that you're working in or a tab that you're working in, to a variable name, and then all the way through the macro you can just refer to that variable name. If later on you want to change the name of the sheet or use the macro somewhere else, all you have to do is go to that first line and change the object which has been allocated to that particular variable name using the set command. A very easy one. Don't assume you know what has been activated and selected when the macro is run. Always specify where changes should be made, and there's a way to completely define that, and again I'm going to talk about that in a later video. Be aware, of course, that other users might not be using the same version of Excel as you're using. Very often it doesn't matter, there's lots of backward compatibility with Excel, but for instance if you're writing a formula in a spreadsheet using a macro, it may well be that previous versions of Excel don't support that formula, so be careful. Best solution of course is that all the users in the organisation use the same version of Excel, but we all know that doesn't always happen. Be careful about the drives which have been assigned on computers. So if you're opening a file and it's on your S drive, well, it may well be that it's on the M drive of the user, so be careful about that. You can also catch a lot of errors, lots of bugs. You can catch them. There's an on error command where if the macro fails, what will happen, instead of it crashing and leaving you the crash message, you can get it to go to a particular line of code and perhaps rescue itself. I'm not sure I really use that very much. I kind of think that if the macro has done something unexpected, very often you just want it to crash and it'd be obvious that it has crashed. What happens then, of course, is the user gives you a call and you can go over and talk to them, sort out what the issue was and fix it for them. Before you write a macro, do think about whether it's worthwhile to do it. You'll get the idea soon enough that it takes quite a lot of effort to write a macro sometimes. There's a lot of debugging that needs to be done and the rest of it. So don't underestimate the amount of time writing a macro. Sometimes it's just better just to get on with it and do the job by hand yourself. But if it is beneficial to use a macro, then they are very efficient, so I would go ahead and encourage you to go ahead when it's appropriate. Yeah, and I think, as I've said here, sometimes if it's about the same, writing a macro is more fun than doing the very repetitive task that you've got to do. Also, remember that not only is the time spent on writing a macro, but if someone else is going to use it, you have to spend time supporting them writing the macro too. So remember that. I just wanted to mention that these videos are done myself. I'm a member of Partnership Resourcefield International. It's part of a blended learning course, and I'd be very happy to run the course for you if you want to get in touch, which you can do if you know my email, or you can do that through the YouTube website. The next video is back to writing a script and should be a bit more fun again, I hope. So I'll see you then. Thanks.